So I had threatened Richard. He was giving me signals. He was going to say, tell you some stories about me. So I said our friendship was on the line. I will tell you one thing as I start. I get introduced lots. I lecture all the time. And when it's the standard academic, she did this and she did that and she did this and she did that, and that's what it's like. I sit there bored to death, and all I can hear in my head is my good Irish Nana saying, "Glory be to God, darling, could you not hold a job?" But it's an amazing experience as I'm a Sister of Charity of Halifax. Richard told you that. When I entered the Sisters of Charity, I'm born and raised in New York. I'm an American by birth, Canadian by adoption, Haligonian by choice. All right. But when I entered, because the Sisters of Charity of Halifax taught me in New York. Half of our sisters have always been in Massachusetts and New York. But when I entered the Sisters of Charity, I'd always wanted to be a doctor. And I was told very explicitly, Nuala, you need to understand that we have nurses, but we don't have doctors. So if you're going to be a Sister of Charity, you're not going to be able to be a doctor. Now, Nuala knew that God wanted her to be a Sister of Charity of Halifax, even though Nuala wanted to be a doctor. So I went to Halifax. 4 years later, I entered the month the Second Vatican Council began. So all the Catholics in the room know what that means, and some of the rest of you have some idea. 4 years later, after my first vows, they say, we're going to send you for higher education. What would you like to do? I said, the only thing I've ever wanted to do was medicine. Ta-da! Moral of the story, because you're going to see it threaded through how I understand life and faith. Even difficult things that come to you, if you trust in the Father's will and love for you, things happen that are beyond your imagination. And the wonderful thing now is, with all this experience, I come now as a doctor, as a medical ethicist, and as a person of faith, to address a number of questions, and the one of dying is what we're going to share on tonight. So the first thing as I begin, and we're going to have to work out a code because there's no remote connection. So I'm going to have to signal the wonderful IT people upstairs, but I wave my arms, so we may see slides going back and forth. But before I start, I really want to just say thank you. You heard some of the people who brought this together. But I want to thank the Men of Faith, the Knights of Columbus, Tim Dunlop, who's been phenomenal. Without Don Cunningham, I wouldn't be here, and he's been a friend for a very long time. But I also want to thank your lovely minister here at St. Paul's United. I mean, Karen was just phenomenally warm and welcoming. And I think this is amazing that we're going to do something together across Christian traditions. So thank you, thank you. So we're going to talk on... You going to start? See, I got to figure this out. So I am a university professor, which means I have to be clear with you about what I'm going to try to do in the next hour or so. All right? I really have two goals. The first is I want to explore with you the long-standing Christian traditions of a good death and the art of dying in the Latin, because you'll know that the book that I've written, and I'll explain how that came to be in a moment, it is rediscovering the art of dying. In the Latin, this is ars moriendi. Sorry, I'm a Catholic. We do Latin. So all the rest of you just hold in there with me. Because you're going to see that the Ars Moriendi was more than Catholic. Just hang in there. Not United Church, because you weren't here yet, but... So the first thing I want to do is I want people to be clear about the Christian tradition of good death and the art of dying. And then I want to begin to get you to understand what the Supreme Court of Canada decision on February 6, 2015 was, how it got slightly modified when it was legislated in Bill C-14, Medical Assistance in Dying. And what I then want to explore with you is the reasons that persons request medically assisted death. I want to show you clearly, regardless of whether your own specific Christian tradition in its formal morality teaching has explicitly rejected, as Roman Catholicism has, medically assisted death, I need you to understand, as a Christian, the reasons persons actually request, not the media hype of dying in intractable pain, but the reasons people actually request medically assisted death. And I want to explore that with you as the challenge of the medicalization of human suffering and dying. Goal one. Goal two, if we understand the challenge to the Christian tradition, the shared Christian tradition, good death and art of dying, then I believe it is incumbent upon us, recognizing the reasons for medically assisted death are issues of suffering. Not basically, sometimes there are intractable issues I'll talk about of pain or other symptoms like shortness of breath, very difficult symptoms to manage at end of life. But I want you to see that if we are going to be prophetically resistant against the medicalization of human suffering, then we have to be prophetic witnesses to the kind of care and compassion that will help alleviate as much of the human suffering people have as possible, and accompany them in their issues of the inevitable suffering and loss that occurs in aging, dying, and in death. And in that second goal, I'm going to challenge you to think of who are those needing the art of accompaniment, as my Holy Father Francis calls it, in your community, here, in this fabulously interesting, very powerful still community that you represent. And then I'm going to offer a challenge, and that is the challenge of protecting the vulnerable. Because despite all of the hype about this being about consent and competence and choice, I want you to understand how vulnerable people are to choose medically assisted death because they have no other options. Now we're going to see if this works. All right. Now this I was going to test to see who the Catholics were in the room. But then I decided, let's not be divisive. We do that too often. Because what I was going to ask was, who is the patron of a good death? So all the Catholics in the room should have, and if not, you report to Sister later. You should have been able to say, St. Joseph. Now, many of the rest of you may have heard this too, but this is a I mean, look, Roman Catholics have patrons for everything, right? This is not very good art, but very representative. This is the death of Joseph. Now, what I want you to do, because you know there are many ways for us to learn and enter into the experience of both love and suffering of others. And some of it is visual. Some of it is narrative. It's the power of story. So I want you to use this visual for a minute. I want you to look at it, and I want you to begin to think of, why is this a good death? What do you see in this piece of art that has elements that would make Joseph's death good? What are the elements? You shout out anything and I'll pick up pieces with it. Oh, he's not alone. Bingo, number one. Not only is he not alone, but who's with him? His family. He is surrounded by his intimate others. And when I do lots of end-of-life and aging ethics, I actually no longer just use family. I use intimate others, because for many elderly, the persons who are closest to them are not their family, And in this medically assisted death stuff, sometimes their family is counter to what their belief about what a good death is. So number one, no one should die alone. No one should die alone, but they should be surrounded by those who love him. Big. What else do you see? Prayer. Okay, look. I want you to look at Joseph and his face. Where is he fixed? On Jesus. Okay. Now this is the son that the father gave to Joseph to raise to human manhood, to teach him how to be a human, right? So this is the great gift. There's very little about Joseph in Scripture, right? But what we do know is, how is he characterized? Righteous, the righteous or the just man. So this is not a scene without sadness, but this is a scene of a man who lived his whole life trying to do what the Lord asked of him, trying to protect the mother, trying to protect the child, try to raise him to be a human, but willing to go to the Father, accepting that he did his best. He did his best. Okay, any other feature? Oh, good, you get extra points. She said, it's Jesus is touching Joseph's hand. Look at it. He's actually physically connected, not just spiritually and emotionally present. And it's the son holding and touching him. Anything else? Well, they're obviously in their own home, but the feature about that, so we can move on, that I think is most important is there's, in addition to these people being present in their own environment, there is, in the midst of the sadness, a peaceful tone to what you see. So I'm a pediatrician, have always done tertiary care medicine, did pediatric palliative care for 34 years, pediatric end of life. I did pediatric oncology, cancer care with children. Okay, I've only ever worked in hospitals. Do you know what the scene is in a dying, cardiac arrest, code blue, groove 14, zap it in here, move it up. Okay, everybody stand back, turn it up, whoop, back, turn up the paddles again. Frenetic. High technology it kind of colors us. So what I want you to know is that the earliest tradition, and again, no scriptural reference for the death of Joseph, but how we've understood it, is that this had features of a good death. Dying with intimate others and loved ones, in attendance, presence. Their presence was more important than a medication, because what's happening here is dying. That there's touch, there's human connection, and death is not an individual event. Here it is a family event, but it's a communal event. So, if we then go 1,400 years later to the medieval period, what developed in Christian countries and Christian nations, so basically Western Europe at the time, because we weren't even in the eye of the beholder at that time, was a tradition of preaching and teaching across the Christian communities. That was the ars moriendi, the art of dying. Now, I can remember somebody saying that I was writing about that, and they said, Nuala, who in the name of God would want to buy a book on the art of dying? And I said, well, if you know what the art of dying is, you might. Because the art of dying, ars moriendi, is the art of living, ars vivendi. But it's the art of living in a time where death came suddenly. You do realize, don't you, that long, lingering death is a phenomena of modern technology. Long, lingering death, that is not the way people died. When you sneeze, why do you say, God bless you? Did you ever think of that? I'll tell you why. Because if you sneeze, the fellow there in the yellow shirt, God forgive me if he just sneezes now. He sneezes, and I say, God bless you. Because in medieval time, rhinorrhea, snuffiness, and sneezing could be the first sign of one of the plagues. So I say, God bless you, because the next time I see you, it's going to be in your grave. Very rapid. This is, in fact, living in a period of time where death comes like a thief in the night. Remember that scripture? Like a thief in the night. So it's being ready at any time for God to take you. Now, even with the sneeze, and then he really gets sick, there are some times when you can call for the priest or the minister. But during the great plagues, particularly bubonic, typhus, the great plagues. So I'm a Monty Python fan. Sorry, that's a little sacrilegious, but remember in The Life of Brian, bring out your dead? Bring out your dead? Well, I mean, it's a caricature, but death was happening so rapidly to so many persons that the art of dying became something that had to be talked about all the time. People had to, the ordinary community, ordinary preaching was constantly saying, be ready, be ready, be ready, because it could happen so rapidly that, in fact, you would not have time for preparation from the priest. So, the medieval ars moriendi was about how to live, and how to live ready so that when death came, particularly if it came suddenly, that you were ready to go to God. Now, this is very important. These are, as we come to our time, this medieval art depended upon two fundamental features of the culture: shared faith in the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus. These were Christian countries, Christian cultures. Everybody, even in the 14th, 15th century, so I'm going to show you in a minute, This is not just Roman Catholic. Hang in there, gang, except for the United Church. Hang in there, because you weren't here yet. The first is, we were talking about the worldview, the life view being Christian, rooted in a shared understanding that death was not the end. What does Scripture say? Dying, he destroyed our death. Rising, he restored our life. We're people of the resurrection. And we had this shared culture. The second thing, crucially important for us to understand, is that in this period of time, so we're talking 14th to 16th century in particular, the importance of families and community in social organization, care for the seriously ill, the dependent elderly, and the dying were family and community responsibilities. So you see how what I'm moving us to think about fits perfectly with the goals that the men of faith and the Knights have wanted for these discussions here. How you can become a compassionate community. Now, because I want you to know, this is not just Catholic. The most famous writings on the Ars Moriendi, I want you to get straight what was happening. Preaching and teaching and discussion and personal and communal prayer all of the time was comfortable with thinking and praying about dying. Just hold that feature. So 3 of the most important writers during this period, the Catholic was Robert Bellarmine, who's a saint, a Catholic saint. But the Anglican, Jeremy Taylor, is a masterful work, for those of you who come from the Anglican tradition, masterful work by Taylor in 1651. And the Lutheran tradition at this time, I don't know if there are any Lutherans in the room, but this was a spectacular series of preaching and teachings by Martin Mahler is available. So this was a universal across the Christian world as it was known at that time. Now, what I want you to think about is you may say to me, Sister Nuala, you know, Joseph dying in a little hut in the first 100 years of the Christian era, 1500, 1600, that's not the way it is. And you're right. But if you look at what happened between 1600 and the beginning of the 20th century, it was pretty much the same. Very little medical advance, little bit at a time. You come to the beginning of the 20th century, I entered medical school in 1967. 1967, I was 2 years old, but I was a prodigy, no. Entered medical school in 1967. Okay, this is a test, and look, there's enough gray hair in the room. Some of you know this. What was the #1 medical headline throughout the world in 1967? Good, who did that? Good man, points for you. The first successful heart transplant in Cape Town, South Africa. All right? Now, just to decide, I'm going to tell you this. In that same fall of 1967, Dame Cecily Saunders opened St. Christopher's Hospice in London. Now, pay attention to this. This is really important. Sister Nuala, as a medical student's whole career was affected by the medical advances that allowed that cardiac transplant and then followed from it. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation, the portable ventilator, modern immunology that allowed organ transplantation. So, dead was not dead anymore. This was a true, in Kuhn's terms, paradigm shift in medicine. But what you need to understand is, in my entire medical career, I was in the 3rd year of my pediatric residency, so into my 7th year of medical training before I ever heard the word hospice or palliative care. Because what had happened to us was we, in fact, had become on the cusp of all of these medical advances converging together. But during this period of time, this is very important, what began to happen was people began to think carefully about being fearful of unwanted medical technologies. In this period, people, in fact, began to say, what does a good death mean in the midst of, you could be resuscitated again and again, you could be brought back to the operating room, you can have your 4th heart transplant. What does all of this mean? And in the literature, before the last 40 years, the literature on what did people, in the midst of these technological advances, so coming into our world, not just Joseph's in the 15th century, what were the characteristics of a good death? Now, this is a summary of literature that could give you millions of references. I'm talking tomorrow night to palliative care department at Queens, and I'll do some detail. But trust sister on this. And look at what the literature shows. And think of the picture that we saw of Joseph. Look at the list. Non-abandonment and continuity of care. So people who, we're going to talk about palliative care in a minute and the importance of hospice palliative care. But people began to fear that if doctors during this period of time, and if there are any retired nurses or docs in the room, you will recognize there was a period of time when once it was clear you were terminally ill, you were put in the room at the end of the corridor and the doctors didn't even do regular rounds on you. Right? Any nurses in the room or patients and families who had that experience. But the characteristics then that were explored in our society, non-abandonment, but continuity of care. And so I've said repeatedly to medical students for 35 years, if I ever hear any of you say that there's nothing more we can do, now we'll do palliative care, I'm going to come back and haunt you. Because that's obscene. Palliative care, and my good friend Ira Byock, a good Jewish boy, has written a fabulous book called The Best Care Possible. Everything else you may have a second chance at. You've only got one chance to help people die. So in actual fact, what we began to see is continuity of care, but it's care that's care of the dying. It's care that's palliative. It's not still pursuing cure. So the characteristics, non-abandonment, continuity of care. Look at the second characteristic, because I want you to see how far we've come in 2018. The avoidance of unwanted technical interventions. People did not want to die with tubes in here and tubes in here and other places that are not ladylike. Third, what people desperately wanted was respectful communication with them and their loved ones. Listening, not just talk. Doctors we have a terrible time. We talk at you. I teach communications, I taught them years ago. And the number of times the average doctor interrupts a patient is frightening. Is frightening. But certainly when we talk about spiritual issues, listening is even more important than asking questions. And then look at the final. Look at the final. The completion of last things. So for those of you who know theology, this is not eschatological. This is not the end of time and judgment. This is what my friend Ira Byock and my friend Harvey Chachinoff, again, comes from a Jewish tradition, psychiatrist in Winnipeg, Manitoba, who does dignity therapy and who definitely is involved in the issue of how do we help people respectfully at the end. They talk about the last things. Ira Byock says, what are the most important things at the end? What are the most important words to say? Think of it. Think of death that you've been at. I love you. I'm sorry. I forgive you. Do you forgive me? And thank you. This is a time when if you've put off for 38 years contacting your brother who you had a spat with that long ago, I'm sorry. There ain't no time left. This is all about, at the end of life, those things are more important than any blood test. They are more important than any procedure. And palliative care, just hold that, incorporated all of these things. But as we came into our world, this was extraordinarily important. Now, as we move into the context of coming into the 20th century, developing some interest in end-of-life care, we actually changed the social context of healthcare. So the context, by the time we're talking about the last half of the last century, remember Ars Moriendi? People talked about it. My mother and father are from Ireland, Irish immigrants. So if any, those of you who are Celts, specifically, the Irish talk about death all the time. Actually, it's ancient Celtic, it's pre-Christian. The space between here and there is, I talk to my Nana. I talk to my mother and father. But many cultures, Mediterranean ones in particular, have difficulty in it. But during Ars Moriendi, what people were comfortable, even though there's a natural human reluctance to be concerned about death. Interesting. People used to be concerned about death. Now they're concerned about dying. Different, because you're going to see what happens with medically assisted death. So the context of our world, this is very interesting to me. We are, in our society, death-denying. But because of our technological advances, we're also death-defying. So we have some people, you'll see I say it at the end, who believe in technology. If you can't do it in Halifax, let's go to Sick Kids. Well, I was at Sick Kids for 6 years. Can't do it at Sick Kids, let's go to Houston. Let's go to Philadelphia Children's. Let's go to Mexico for unproven treatment. Somewhere there is a technological response to either the dying process or to suffering. So we're death-denying and death-defying. We, in all of our traditions, including my own, Catholic, which has lots of great moral teaching on this, we're confused about end-of-life care. There are many people who think that recognizing the goals of palliative hospice care are the goals, not cure, and not even substantial significant improvement in function, which is what most medicine is about. They think that's, historically, they thought that was somehow or other participating in assisted death. But we have the medicalization of all aspects of life. This is very important. There's not one aspect of human life that does not have a medical specialty. We can tell you how to make a baby. We can tell you how to have the baby, feed the baby, raise the baby, deal with adolescent crisis. We can tell you how to pick your mate. We can tell you how to in fact, separate. And you don't believe that? You go look at the television shows now that are about, I got to fix this. See, I didn't have my Botox this week. Make this bigger, make this smaller, or make that bigger. We actually have come to medicalize every aspect of human life. By the way, the opioid crisis that we're facing, even the legalization of marijuana, by the way, are not irrelevant to any kind of distress. Do you remember those of you who are old enough to remember the old Alka-Seltzer ad? Plop, plop, fizz, fizz, relief is just a swallow away. We actually believe so much in, because medicine can do phenomenal things. But there are limits. There are limits. We've also had, particularly over the past 45 years in Canada, in the West, Western Europe, United States, but in Canada, a corruption of language about end-of-life care. We started out with this being mercy killing, and then people said, no, you can't use the word killing. That's what it is. Killing is, that's what, but the police will kill someone, but their moral culpability has to do with intention and motivation. So because you're merciful in the killing, it's still an act that, in fact, is morally wrong. And then the question is, what do we mean by mercy? But they said, don't use killing. Then it became interesting, the right to die. Talk about the silliest expression I've ever heard. How can I say to any of you, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you the right to die? What do you mean? You're all going to die. What that is about, and this is what became clear as we moved into our era and what we see with the Supreme Court, what they were talking about is not the right to die, but the right to control the circumstances of their dying. All right? So, but people were all confused about that. And then as we came into the 20th and into the 21st century even more, individualism, choice, and control are the ultimate values. Dependence, you gotta be kidding. The ultimate sin for anyone in Western world. Ultimate sin. Ultimate sin. And what does that mean about community? Dying is now an individual event. You had nothing, your death had nothing to do with anybody else. You total violation of everything we know and have historically believed. And then where we come, as a result of this social context changing, is the legalization of medically assisted suicide. So let me just show you briefly the elements of this so we can come to some of the challenges for us. The Supreme Court of Canada, in February 6, 2015, decriminalized medically assisted death. Now, this is important. It decriminalized in Canada both medically assisted suicide. That's when you request suicide, I write a prescription, and I give you the prescription for you to take whenever or not at all, but I'm not present when or if you take it. That's actually not happening in Canada because we don't want to put lethal drugs in drug cabinets with the opioid crisis we have. But it also legalized medically performed euthanasia. You request, I end your life, and I, as the doctor, inject you. I have to be present at the time of your death. Now, you need to understand that throughout most of Western Europe, what had happened was medically assisted suicide. In Canada, the Supreme Court decision opened both. On February 6, 2015, we had the most liberal assisted death rules in the world. We made the folks in Western Europe look like wimps. But it wasn't for everything. It was for competent patients, of a whole competence, because I want to talk about vulnerability and protection of the vulnerable. For a grievous medical condition, grievous meaning serious, including an illness, disease, or disability. Including an illness, disease, or disability. Hold that. That is irremediable, meaning it cannot be relieved by means acceptable to the individual. Doesn't mean it can't be relieved, but the patient doesn't like the side effects or the conditions for treatment. And then third, and this is the key, the Supreme Court did say what this was about, causes enduring suffering that is intolerable to the individual. Now, you and I, none of us can know the suffering of another. We can't judge that they are or they are not suffering. That's the key. But if we look at then what happened in understanding this decision, since February 6, 2015, medically assisted, it was legal, it just wasn't regulated yet. But I want you to pay attention to this. The Supreme Court decision was not limited, it did not even mention terminal illness or dying. Did you notice that? Illness, disease, disability. Perfectly healthy 38-year-old in a car accident with traumatic blindness. Everything else about them is perfectly fine, but they now have traumatic blindness. They are eligible. I can give you lots of other examples. But what happened was the federal government at the time, so this is not a political, but the Progressive Conservatives in party at the time, did nothing to try and narrow, because they had to regulate this. There was a stay of the Supreme Court decision. We're the only country in the world that legalized medically assisted death by a Supreme Court decision, and it was on a Charter of Rights and Freedoms decision. People had the right to control the circumstances of the death, and they had the right to get assistance in performing their death. So there was a stay for legislation. When the liberals came in, they tried to add the issue of dying, kind of anticipated dying, or reasonably foreseeable death was the language. But I need you to understand in the Supreme Court decision, they assumed that the vulnerable would be protected, and that there would be protection of conscience either for religious or philosophical reasons. So those were assumptions. By the time we got Bill C-14, the liberals had added this reasonably foreseeable natural death, still emphasizing the importance of voluntary request, still about illness, disease, and disability, only now with death foreseen. 3 issues we're still waiting for decisions. The use of an advance directive, and that what that means is that you could today, this has profound implication for the aging population, because the more elderly we have, the more cases of dementia of all types we have. So an advance directive situation, this is what they really mean is that today when I'm competent, I mean, advanced planning is important, but what they mean in dying is, I say, if a situation happens that I can't recognize my son, then I want to be put to death. And that could happen 6 months later, 4 years later. The problem is that the legislation required that if you requested medically assisted death, that just before the act is finally performed, you actually consent again. It's a double check. So you see, this now becomes a contradiction to even what the Supreme Court was saying is important about choice. Second, mature minors. This is not about babies, though, God protect me from what the Canadian Pediatric Society, my own specialty, is beginning to talk about euthanizing newborns, as they do in countries in Western Europe. See, if it's a good thing to end my life because I'm suffering, then we should do that for others who are suffering. That's part of what we call the slippery slope argument. But mental illness as the sole condition is now one of the 3 things we're waiting for decisions about. Can you believe this? This means that the only thing that you can have wrong with you is bipolar disease. I mean, it's a terrible condition. But that in and of itself, because it causes suffering, can in fact make you eligible. So we're waiting for decisions on all of these 3. So what I want you to do now is we're kind of moving into the kind of what does this mean for us. I want you to know that this list, there's huge validation for this. It's almost exactly the list that was presented to the Supreme Court itself. It's the actual reasons people request medically assisted death. So there is a small number with intractable pain or, as I said, other symptoms like shortness of breath. And God knows we need more research on those difficult conditions. But the reasons people request this is around the world, where it's legal, where it's not legal, validated extraordinarily well in the state of Oregon. Feelings of loss of dignity, dependence and the loss of control, guilt at being a burden to others, especially family, right? Guilt. Isolation and loneliness, uncertainty regarding future care needs. When it gets worse, what's going to happen? Who's going to be with me when? And then finally, hopelessness and loss of meaning. I want to suggest to you that these are issues of suffering. It is what the Supreme Court is, suffering. And now I want you to think of this. What is the difference between pain and suffering? And I'm just going to tell you, in Sister Nuala's shorthand, I created this little. It's the difference between chest pain and heartache. I want you to think about this, okay? All right, now, I've got a gentleman here, so don't do this for demonstration purposes. But if my friend here had chest pain here and now, Don't do that. Don't do it. If he did. Well, I mean, I'm a baby doctor and I'm out of clinical practice. But I and my colleagues in medicine and nursing, cardiovascular surgery, cardiology, interventional radiology, do we have stuff we can do for you? That's chest pain. We got stuff we can do for you. This lovely lady in the end, please God, this is not true for you. She has constant heartache because she has lost a grandson to drugs and prostitution on the street in Vancouver. She and the family have no idea of his whereabouts for the last 2 years. This is the apple of her eye, her love. She wakes every morning with her heart squeezed because of the suffering. She goes to bed every night praying to God, please take care of him. Please take care of him. That's heartache. As a doctor, I need to recognize it. But I have no drug or device for heartache. Begin to think about what the difference is and how we have now begun to respond. So, in this little book that I put together, which was my response as a physician, what doctors have done in accepting to be agents of death has crushed my soul, just awful. But then as a Catholic Christian, my concern was to begin to understand sources of suffering, because I don't dispute people suffer. We don't choose suffer, and we have an obligation to relieve it, but we need to understand its roots. Where does it come from? I began to look to Jesus. It was actually from the Hebrews, and those of you who have read the book. In Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, it says, "For we do not have a high priest who does not know our weakness, but one like us in everything except sin." If we don't believe that, then you're not a Christian. I'm sorry. He did become fully human. He is everything that we experience, Jesus has experienced in his own way. So I began to explore in Jesus' life the kinds of sufferings. And it's interesting, I did the Stations of the Cross because I'm staying with the Jesuits. And fantastic hospitality. So they're Jesuits here, so I got to say that. But I'm up at the shrine, fantastic. I did the Stations of the Cross this afternoon. And the Stations of the Cross, the traditional ones, they're not exactly scripturally based. There's a whole bunch of stuff that are not in scriptures, but they're a great piety. But I think the important thing is that piety in the three falls of Jesus that you see in the traditional scriptures are capturing three different kinds of suffering. There is physical suffering. There's the suffering that comes from physical pain. If you have a certain kind of suffering, but it can be relieved when the pain is relieved. The suffering itself is related to the physical. There is emotional and psychological suffering. And the story that I use here is actually a super independent elderly woman who has a fall and cannot go back home again and is put in one of these. In Halifax, it's like a waiting area trying to find some place to put this elder, super proud, super independent, linked to her own parish community, close to a niece who was the only relative who helped her. And she's moved to the nearest available bed, nowhere near anybody. I mean, this is psychological suffering, emotional suffering. We got to begin to think of the ways in which people have that kind of suffering. Then spiritual suffering. I actually use a case I dealt with. Super, super devout Roman Catholic young couple. Long story, read it in the book, it's real. Had problems with fertility, prayed to St. Anne. What young person prays to St. Anne to have a baby? Had a baby. Okay? Think everything now is perfect. And at 4.5 years of age, her little boy wakes up one morning with what she thought was a cold, and I pronounced him dead in the emergency department at 9 o'clock that night with meningococcal meningitis. She not only lost a child, but she lost her faith in God, because her faith was, if you do the right thing, God blesses you. And he blesses you the way you want to be blessed. This is spiritual suffering. The next the two different chapters in the book, two different kinds of suffering that I began to explore. And you'll see it when we talk about the people we have to accompany. Feelings of loss of dignity. When you read the story of Ellie, a story that was given to me by a good friend of mine who works at St. Boniface in Manitoba, I mean, a woman who was marginalized, and her sense of loss of dignity, I mean, just like Jesus was stripped and mocked. I mean, her sense of loss of dignity was profound because of the illness experience, but also loss of identity in physical and cognitive loss. Right? So these are the kinds of sufferings that we saw, and the kinds of sufferings that we see in real life people today. So I went where I always go when I don't know what to do. I go to the Lord. And this is Jesus in Gethsemane. So now we're going to talk about suffering and responding to it. Because in Gethsemane, what we see is Jesus with his three buddies, because he can't be alone in his suffering. He takes the three best apostles down. They're down at the bottom of the hill. He goes up to pray to the Father, and he collapses. The word in Aramaic is collapse. It collapses. He's not yet physically harmed, but his anticipation that horrible things are going to happen overwhelm him. And he's down on the ground. Father, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this. Please, please, I don't want to do this. Now, if there was one human in history who would have been given a do not stop at suffering card, it would have been Jesus. What happens, and we don't know exactly what that third time he goes up and down to the Father, but he comes down accepting that no matter how bad things are, he believes the Father will see him through it and make things happen that could be unimaginable. And we're here today because of the resurrection and that actually happening. So, I think as Christians we need to begin to think of the kinds of suffering that are out there that we could help people with, regardless of what your own particular spiritual tradition now says explicitly about medically assisted death. First, I want to say absolutely positively, hooray for you for hospice. Hospice and palliative care have been the places that allow the conditions for a good death in the 20th and 21st century. Fantastic. But what I want you to see now is that the original philosophy of palliative care was that it neither hastened nor prolonged death. That's the original philosophy. It balanced pain and symptom control with those last things. Good hospice palliative care focuses on the person who is dying and their loved ones. And look at the last comment I'm seeing here. While I absolutely, positively applaud and believe we need to be politically active and active as communities in providing hospice and palliative care, you need to know that hospice and palliative care units are not free from having medically assisted death performed in their buildings. Protection of conscience for Catholic facilities, it's marginal, even in Ontario at best, it's going to go. And protection of conscience for those in palliative care. So we have a challenge to protect hospice and palliative care in its original goals. But as persons, as individuals, I'm coming now to the challenge for the community. I think that what we're asked to do is what the kids say when they say, walk the talk. If we are going to be resistant to the medicalization of human suffering and death, and I believe Christians should, then we have to be prophetic witnesses to care and accompaniment. My own Holy Father, Francis, uses the art of accompaniment, phenomenal language. Because remember, it's the presence, it's the non-abandonment, it's being with that is crucially important, particularly at end of life. This is a picture of Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Think of it, think of it. What happened here? The two fellows are walking along to Emmaus, and then Jesus comes up behind him, and, what are you talking about? And what do they say? Do you not know what happened? And what did the fellows on the road say? We had hoped. We thought it was going to turn out this way, and it's turning out another way. So the art of accompaniment really is to do as Jesus did, to walk with, to listen to, and attempt to provide support along the way. So now I ask you, who in Midland, Penetanguishene, did I say that correctly? Needs accompaniment today? I'm going to suggest to you that the acutely ill and hospitalized, facing all kinds of decisions, life-threatening and other, the chronically ill and handicapped, we do a great job in acute care, even though sometimes you have to wait for it. I think we're the pits when it comes to chronic illness and handicap. We're even worse when it comes to the mentally ill, especially the chronically mentally ill. How open to the mentally ill is your Christian community? How about the frail and dependent elderly? Again, go to the story that I've got in the book. You can get thousands of dollars of health care, and then there's no place to send you home because residential care and long-term care is abysmal in our country for the elderly. It's a crisis. When the demography of our country is aging. Care of the dying. Care of the bereaved. An important issue. In a society where they want things done fast, get it over with fast, plop, plop, fizz, fizz, the issue of bereavement and care of those who are bereaved is a serious issue for us. And then I'm going to add, as we show you some pictures, and I challenge you before you comment with me, the poor and those that my Pope says are on the peripheries. So I want you to think of some of these visuals, because these are some of the real people that we have to begin to see anew, walk with, listen to. And most important now as we close, I want to say that the medically assisted death legislation has valorized competent individual choice and control and fails to recognize the profound vulnerability that the situations of illness that we've just looked at bring to persons. This is a wonderful article, by the way, it's by a feminist philosopher. Not always in sync with Catholic moral teaching, but nevertheless, this is brilliant. Vulnerability belongs to the human condition. Suffering is not optional. Suffering belongs to the human condition. There's an inherent vulnerability. There's a situational vulnerability, and particularly social isolation. There is a pathological vulnerability in things like neglect, stigma, and abuse. We need to recognize that just at the same time, we legalized medically assisted death before we delivered on the promise of palliative care in this country. And now what we're seeing is that there's a growing vulnerability of those who are on the peripheries. The severity of disability and multiple disadvantage, lack of support for so many who are poor or lower middle class, just basically getting by, increasing look at the crisis in suicide in our young people today. I mean, it's huge. Poverty and unemployment, violence, abuse and insecurity, and then aging, particularly the conditions of residence and dementia. So you need to understand that while there's this valorization of choice, there's a huge issue where we, and there are many groups, including the Vulnerable Persons Standard Project, Catherine Frazier's group, if you don't know of it, has tried to look at protecting the vulnerable to medically assisted death. Because if you have lack of choices because of social inequality, poverty, nurture, it's the social economic determinants of life, or if you have disordered insights into making decisions because of self-stigma, depression, hopelessness, mental health, because of inducements, influence, and coercion. We've got case after case of situations where, for example, with the elderly, adult children are saying, well, Mama, you don't have to, it's really, but you now have another option. And it's not simply that the adult child is offering an option, but let's face it, it's easy to take care for somebody in the short term. Illness, disease, and disability over the long term takes its toll. And we see all kinds of situations where it influence, and remember the reasons? Guilt at being a burden to others, especially loved ones. Huge issue, huge issue. Altering this notion of, I'm in control of this is free choice, like buying a new blouse or a new car. And then social attitudes and biases. This is the kind of person. This is a homeless family. Can you imagine what happens now when that mom gets sick or those children do? This is an individual on the street her whole life. What happens when she gets a heart attack? When she develops a medical condition? So I believe, as I'm closing for you now, that the challenges for disciples of Christ today are prophetic resistance to the inappropriate use of technology, a technological response to a spiritual and communal crisis, and to the medicalization of human suffering. Because remember, this is not about death and dying alone. The extension here is phenomenal. I think we need to actively promote hospice and palliative care, but remember the caveats. Remember the caveats, even as you do your phenomenal work in hospice here. And that means we, you and I, and all our communities, we have got to stop believing that professional services will care for all of these things. Professional services, even at their best, can never and will never be able to do it all, nor should it. Remember the Ars Moriendi? That the care of the sick and suffering is not just for families, but it's families and communities. So the challenges are great. Dying, he destroyed our death. Rising, he restored our life. I believe that my Savior lives. How am I going to witness to that? Thanks.
On behalf of all of us here, and also on behalf of the men of faith in our compassionate community, we really do want to thank you so much for being here. So these are gifts I've been asked to pass on. They're not actually from moi, but we really do appreciate your insight and your perspective tonight.
Thank you.
I also want to say, I'm Karen. I'm the minister here at the United Church of Canada. And we were originally asked because we're kitty corner to the MCC and we were to be the overflow place. And then they realized we had cameras and we can live stream and we're doing all of that. And so we became the main site. And I just think it's wonderful when you know, Christians in our different denominations, we can fight till the cows come home. We have our philosophical and theological differences, but we sure have a lot in common, and we forget that. And so for all people of the Christian faith, other faiths, or no faiths, what a privilege to talk about these important issues and to really raise them. I also wanted to personally thank you for your book. So our congregation had 25 people. We've studied this book the last 6 weeks. And we knew it was a very Catholic book, obviously. And I have to tell you, folks, we really appreciated this book. Not only your perspectives, it is all about dying and compassionate death and issues surrounding it. The illustrations really got us thinking. And there are questions at the end of each chapter that were really invited and engaged us in some very serious conversations. So if you're thinking about buying this book, I'm going to take it one more step. Look around and see who else has bought the book. Tap them on the shoulder and say, do you think we could meet? And where 2 or 3 are gathered, you could have these conversations. And we found, we divided into 5 groups at times. Just hearing one another's perspectives was also a gift of God and grace for us. Lastly, and I believe this is what Tim wants me to announce, thank you. This is what Tim. I want to say thank you to Tim Dunlop and the guys who organized this. We're really grateful. Thank you so much. And I also know that there's tea, coffee, and refreshments and cookies downstairs, and we're really hoping you'll come down. Well, actually, we're not, because I'm a cookie monster, and, you know, I could leave the cookies, but no, really, truly, we're hoping you'll come downstairs and join us for fellowship. I believe there's book signing going on down there, and Sister will be available to talk to you. Should you need an elevator, if you go through these doors and around the corner, I and maybe some other volunteers will be happy to take you down. Okay?
We'd like to have a few minutes for some questions. We have a couple mics up front here. If anybody...
So what she just said is we are live streaming. And so you need to come to the microphone. Otherwise, those who are listening on live streaming will not be able to hear you.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that you will share among yourselves, either at the reception or, as Karen said, in small groups. But if there's any, for 10 minutes, you don't have to ask a question. It should be your own experience, your own comment. You can even criticize me. I sob very quietly. But these are serious, serious issues, right? This is about how we are with each other. And it does go to the nature of community as well as inappropriate belief in technologies. Anything anybody wants to say, or do you want to just go on down and talk? No, you can't. They can't get it on the.
Hello? I was a nurse for 25 years, mostly the emergency department. But the one thing with all of this, if you have somebody that's dying, ask them how they feel about it, and ask them, do they know they're dying? Yeah. Because a lot of the situations, you'll get the doctors, write the orders, the nurses come in, set up, you're dying, and nobody has said, do you know you're dying? That is a major, that happens all the time.
So rule number 1, Dr. Kenny's rule number 1, is always listen to the nurses. Now, I'm dead serious. To emphasize, so advanced care planning as a spiritual activity. I mean, thinking and talking about, for those of you, everybody in this room who's as gray as I, or not even as gray, any of you with a major medical condition of any kind, you need to clarify your own values. You need to talk to your loved ones and your health care providers about what you want. And then you need to appoint someone to speak to you in the situation when you can't, who will do what you want. It's not what your son wants. The conflicts now across families with medically assisted death are becoming huge. So this is an advanced care plan. All of this needs to be more clear. And the medical record and all of that has to indicate what your thoughts are. But more importantly, I think, you need to know, even those folks in palliative care, and there's an article that was been written in the last year in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. Colleagues in palliative care are so concerned that there are so many, they call it the P word. And they don't use the P word, because you have adult children in particular saying, "Don't you dare say anything about palliative care to my father. He'll give up hope." You do need to understand, to your point, if people know, even children, I did death with children for 34 years. You talk about tough stuff. You see an 11-year-old who's dying, and his mom and dad won't let me talk, not to tell him what I want to tell him, but to listen to what he needs to hear. Because they don't want to scare him, or they do whatever. And you're saying, don't you understand that this 11-year-old in his mind is thinking, my God, Mom cries every time she comes in here. I'm getting away with murder every time I misbehave. Grammy and Grandpa just flew in from Kamloops. What is going on here? We have to be able to open this to what is it that the dying person, you're so right. What is it that the dying person needs to hear, needs to say? And remember, the hope that if a dying person still has a hope and a cure, then that's futile. But if they lose the opportunity to do the last things, that's a sin. To lose the opportunity. So everything that you said is absolutely, it's interesting. So just remember one thing. The literature shows clearly that when a person expresses interest in medically assisted death today, throughout medical history, patients have said, "Doc, can't you do something? Can't you shorten it?" In the Hippocratic tradition, 1,400 years Hippocratic tradition, even at the request of a patient, you do not provide a deadly drug. But what happened historically was when a patient said that, the doctor sat down, if he or she was good, and reviewed their care, and reviewed both the medical condition and the spiritual condition. You know what happens now? And this is documented beautifully in Oregon, so they've got almost 10 years experience. Now when a person says to a doctor, I want you to try to do something with this. I want to kind of get rid of this. Instead of sitting down and reviewing, is this just a cry for help? Does this mean we have to begin to look at the care, spiritual as well as medical? They immediately go to medical eligibility. They move to the legal. And why is that? Because the issue of sitting down and reviewing care is going to be time-consuming. All of this stuff is, once something is the new normal, and medically assisted death is becoming the new normal. Okay? So the issue of listening, opening, hearing what the dying person, because if the person is dying, they need to know that so that they can decide what their end-of-life care is. Good on you.
First of all, sister, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming here to our community. It's opening up our eyes and our hearts to a lot of things that people don't understand. I, too, am a retired nurse of 37 years. And the part of listen to nurses, I only wish my partner would hear that. But I'm also a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces. I've divided myself to Hospice Huronia and my Legion. I believe in palliative and the hospice for respect and dignity, and I do that on the mandate of veterans. And being involved with the Hospice Huronia, I expand that to my community. My question to you is, as much as I appreciate what you've said today, there's been no mention for care for the caregivers. I worked at the Mental Health Center in Penetang, Oak Ridge Division when I got out of the military. And to my knowledge, we've had 19 plus staff commit suicide. And we listen to a lot of things as nurses, whether it be in acute care or anything else. But we talk about hospice and everything as if it's our job. It's when you enter into nursing at that level, it's more than a job. It comes from your faith, whether you believe in God or not, but it comes into caring. And I think you also have to focus in regards to care for the caregivers. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, so you know what I said about listening to nurses? Listen to what he said too. So we'll just take one other question after this one, but I got to because you're so right. Tomorrow night, when I talk to the palliative care department at Queen's University, the title is Moral Distress in Palliative Care from Medically Assisted Dying. And really what I'm talking about is, regardless of what you think about the legalized issue,